debacle, sham since I've been in politics. And if you really wanted to know the truth...
Okay, so the Supreme Court just delivered what might be the most brutal institutional blow to Trump's presidency since he took office in January. And the White House is in absolute panic mode right now. We're talking about a decision that came down less than 24 hours ago, that has sent shockwaves through the entire federal government, through Trump's legal team, through the Republican leadership in Congress, and frankly, through anyone who understands what this actually means for the balance of power in this country. The Supreme Court has effectively blocked Trump from concealing his financial records any longer. And here's the part that should make everyone sit up and pay attention. They've given him 24 hours to comply or face potential contempt proceedings that could theoretically include jail time for obstruction. Now, before we dive into exactly what happened and why this is so much bigger than it might look on the surface, I need to say something really important about how we're getting our news these days. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. They're going to give you the sanitized version. The version that doesn't upset their corporate sponsors. The version that treats this like just another legal dispute when what we're actually witnessing is a fundamental crisis about presidential accountability and whether the most powerful person in the country is above the law. That's why we built U.S. Politics Exposed to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines and understand what's really happening in Washington while everyone else is reading yesterday's talking points, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We bring the news straight to you every single day. No filter, no spin. Just the facts and the analysis you need to understand what's actually going on. Just hit the subscribe button below to join us. And if you want to support this work and be part of a community that truly cares about the truth and about holding power accountable no matter who's in office, this is your moment. Subscribe. Drop a comment below telling us what you think about this Supreme Court decision. And let's build something that actually matters. Here's what happened. The Supreme Court issued an order yesterday afternoon that essentially pulled the rug out from under one of Trump's longest-running legal strategies, which has been to fight tooth and nail to keep his financial records, his tax returns, his business dealings, his foreign transactions. Basically everything that might show conflicts of interest or potential violations of the Emoluments Clause or financial crimes. This has been going on 4 years at this point. It started during his first term. It continued through the 2024 campaign. And when he took office again in January 2025, his legal team immediately moved to reassert executive privilege and claimed that as a sitting president, he has absolute immunity from having to turn over these documents to anyone, including Congress, including federal prosecutors, including oversight bodies that are literally designed to investigate exactly this kind of thing. The case that came before the Supreme Court involves multiple sets of financial records. We're talking about tax returns going back more than a decade. We're talking about financial statements from the Trump Organization. We're talking about records of loans from foreign banks. We're talking about documents that detail his business relationships with entities in Russia, in Saudi Arabia, in the United Arab Emirates, in China. Congressional committees have been trying to get these records through subpoenas. The House Oversight Committee issued a subpoena. The Senate Judiciary Committee issued a subpoena. Multiple federal prosecutors in ongoing criminal investigations have issued subpoenas. And every single time, Trump's lawyers have fought back with every legal maneuver available, claiming executive privilege, claiming that this is a politically motivated witch hunt, claiming that forcing a sitting president to disclose his financial records violates the separation of powers and would set a dangerous precedent that would weaken the presidency forever. The case went through the lower courts, and every single court basically said the same thing. Executive privilege does not give you a blanket shield to hide financial records that might show criminal activity or conflicts of interest. Congressional oversight is a legitimate constitutional function, and you don't get to just refuse to comply because you don't like the investigation. Trump's team appealed, and it went up to the Supreme Court, which agreed to hear arguments but declined to issue a stay, meaning the subpoenas technically remained in effect, but Trump kept stalling by asking for extensions and procedural delays. And then yesterday, the Supreme Court issued an order that basically ended the game. They didn't just rule against Trump on the merits, although they did that too. They went further. They said that the delays have gone on long enough, that the legal arguments his team has been making are without merit, and that he has 24 hours from the time the order was issued to begin turning over the requested documents to the relevant congressional committees and to federal prosecutors. And if he fails to comply within that time frame, the court is authorizing contempt proceedings. Now, here's where this gets absolutely wild. Contempt of the Supreme Court is not a joke. It's not a slap on the wrist. It's not a fine that you pay and move on. Contempt can include sanctions. It can include financial penalties that escalate daily until you comply. And in extreme cases, it can include arrest and detention until you agree to follow the court's order. The Supreme Court has the authority to enforce its own orders. And what they're essentially saying here is that if Trump continues to defy a lawful subpoena after the highest court in the land has told him to comply, they will treat it as an attack on the judicial system itself and respond accordingly. Let's be really clear about what this means in practice. Trump now has a choice, and it's a choice he absolutely hates. He can comply within 24 hours, which means his financial records, the things he has spent literally years and millions of dollars in legal fees trying to hide, are about to become available to congressional investigators and federal prosecutors who are going to go through them with a fine-tooth comb looking for anything that might constitute a crime, a conflict of interest, a violation of campaign finance law, a violation of the Emoluments Clause, or he can refuse to comply, in which case the Supreme Court has made it clear they will initiate contempt proceedings. And we're talking about a situation where the President of the United States could theoretically be facing legal consequences up to and including detention for defying a court order. Now, realistically, is the Supreme Court actually going to jail the sitting president? Probably not in the literal sense. But what they can do, and what they're clearly signaling they're willing to do, is impose escalating financial sanctions, refer the matter to Congress for potential impeachment proceedings on the grounds of obstruction of justice and contempt of court, and create a situation where Trump is in open defiance of the Supreme Court, which would be a constitutional crisis of a magnitude we have genuinely never seen in American history. You'd be looking at a situation where the executive branch is in direct conflict with the judicial branch, where the president is essentially saying that court orders don't apply to him, and where the fundamental principle that no one is above the law is being tested in real time on the national and international stage. And here's the problem that the White House is dealing with right now. This isn't just a legal issue. This is a political nightmare, and it's an institutional credibility disaster. Domestically, you've got Republicans in Congress who are already deeply nervous about the 2026 midterms and about whether defending Trump on this is going to cost them their seats. You've got vulnerable Republicans in swing districts who are being asked by reporters whether they think the president should comply with the Supreme Court, and there's no good answer for them. If they say yes, he should comply, they're breaking with Trump and risking a primary challenge from a MAGA candidate. If they say no, he shouldn't have to comply, they're essentially arguing that the president is above the law and that court orders are optional, which is going to absolutely destroy them with independent voters and moderates who still believe in the rule of law. You've got Senate Republicans who are trying to figure out how to navigate this because some of them actually care about institutional norms and some of them remember that they're supposed to be a co-equal branch of government, not just a rubber stamp for whatever the president wants. And you've got the Republican leadership in both chambers who are getting absolutely hammered with questions about whether they're going to stand up for the separation of powers or whether they're going to let the president defy the Supreme Court internationally. This is an absolute disaster for American credibility. You've got allies in Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East, who are watching this and asking themselves whether the United States is a country that operates under the rule of law or whether it's becoming an autocracy where the person in power gets to ignore courts and oversight when it's convenient. You've got adversaries like Russia and China who are absolutely loving this because it feeds their propaganda narrative that American democracy is broken and hypocritical, that the U.S. lectures other countries about corruption and transparency, while its own president refuses to disclose his financial records and defies court orders. You've got international investors and financial markets that are looking at this and starting to worry about stability and predictability. Because if the president won't follow Supreme Court orders, what else might he decide he doesn't have to follow? Treaties, trade agreements, financial regulations. And you've got foreign governments that have been dealing with Trump and trying to figure out whether he's making decisions based on American interests or based on his personal financial interests. And now those questions are about to potentially get answered when these financial records come out and we see exactly who he owes money to, who he's doing business with, and where his financial incentives actually lie. Now, let's talk about what's actually in these financial records that Trump is so desperate to hide. Because understanding that is key to understanding why he's been fighting this so hard and why the Supreme Court's decision is such a massive deal. We know from previous reporting and from partial disclosures that have come out over the years that Trump has financial relationships with entities in Russia, that he has loans from Deutsche Bank that have raised questions about whether he's financially compromised, that he has business deals in Saudi Arabia and the UAE that have brought in hundreds of millions of dollars. Congressional investigators want to see the full picture. They want to see the tax returns because those will show sources of income. They'll show deductions. They'll show whether he's paying anything close to what he should be paying or whether he's using aggressive tax avoidance strategies that might cross the line into fraud. They want to see the financial statements from the Trump Organization because those will show what he told banks about the value of his assets when he was trying to get loans. And then they can compare that to what he told tax authorities about the value of those same assets when he was trying to minimize his tax burden, and if those numbers don't match up, that's financial fraud. They want to see records of foreign transactions because those might show payments from foreign governments or foreign state-owned enterprises directly or indirectly to Trump-owned businesses, which would be a clear violation of the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution, which explicitly prohibits the president from receiving payments from foreign governments. Federal prosecutors want these records for criminal investigations that are ongoing. There are investigations into whether Trump violated campaign finance laws by using business funds to pay hush money to people during the 2016 and 2024 campaigns. There are investigations into whether he obstructed justice by trying to interfere with previous investigations into his finances. There are investigations into whether he committed bank fraud or insurance fraud by inflating or deflating the value of his properties depending on what was advantageous at the time. There are investigations into whether he violated sanctions laws by doing business with entities that were supposed to be off-limits. And all of these investigations have been stalled because Trump has been able to keep the financial records hidden by claiming executive privilege and by dragging things out in court. Well, that game is over now. The Supreme Court has said the privilege doesn't apply here. The delays have gone on long enough, and you have 24 hours to start handing over the documents or face the consequences. Okay, let's break down what this actually means, because this is about so much more than just one president's financial records. First, understand that this is a fundamental question about whether the presidency comes with the power to avoid accountability. Trump's legal argument throughout this whole process has essentially been that as president, he has near absolute immunity from investigation. That executive privilege covers basically everything he doesn't want to disclose, and that forcing him to turn over his financial records would weaken the presidency and set a precedent that future presidents would be subjected to endless harassment from political opponents in Congress. The Supreme Court has now definitively rejected that argument. They've said that executive privilege is not a blanket shield, That congressional oversight is a core constitutional function that doesn't disappear just because the person being investigated is the president, and that no one, not even the president, is above the law. This is huge. This is the Supreme Court, including justices that Trump himself appointed, telling him that he doesn't get to make up his own rules. That this separation of powers includes checks and balances that apply to the executive branch, and that if Congress or federal prosecutors have a legitimate reason to see your financial records, you don't get to just say no because you feel like it. Second, this has massive implications for the 2026 midterms and for Trump's ability to govern for the rest of his term. If those financial records come out and they show what a lot of people suspect they're going to show, which is conflicts of interest, potential financial crimes, payments from foreign governments, loans from sketchy sources, all of that becomes ammunition for Democrats in the midterms. They're going to run on a platform of accountability and transparency and rule of law. And they're going to point to Trump's financial records as evidence that he's corrupt, that he's compromised, that he's using the presidency to enrich himself and his family, and that Republicans in Congress are complicit because they've been protecting him and blocking oversight. Republicans who are already nervous about losing seats in swing districts are going to be in an impossible position because they're either going to have to defend the indefensible or break with Trump and risk a primary challenge. You're also going to see this energize the Democratic base in a way that could turn the midterms into a referendum on Trump's conduct and on whether Congress is going to hold him accountable or let him get away with whatever he wants. If Democrats take back the House or expand their majority or make gains in the Senate, you're looking at a completely different political landscape for the second half of Trump's term, with congressional investigations ramping up, with potential impeachment proceedings back on the table, and with Trump's agenda basically dead in the water because he's going to be spending all his time fighting legal battles and political scandals. Third, this fundamentally shifts the balance of power between the branches of government in a way that's going to outlast this presidency. What the Supreme Court is establishing here is that executive privilege has limits, that the president cannot simply refuse to comply with lawful subpoenas from Congress or from federal prosecutors, and that the courts have the authority and the willingness to enforce their orders even against a sitting president. This sets a precedent. It means that future presidents are going to know that they can't just stonewall congressional oversight and hope the courts will back them up. It means that Congress's investigative powers are real and enforceable, not just theoretical. And it means that the idea of the imperial presidency, the idea that the executive branch can do whatever it wants without being subject to meaningful checks from the other branches, is being directly challenged and rejected. This is a win for the separation of powers. This is a win for the rule of law. And this is a reminder that the system of checks and balances is supposed to work even when it's uncomfortable, and even when it involves investigating the most powerful person in the country. Fourth, let's talk about what happens if Trump decides to defy the order. If he refuses to comply within the 24-hour window, the Supreme Court has already said they're prepared to initiate contempt proceedings. That would mean escalating sanctions, potentially daily fines that keep increasing until he complies, and a referral to Congress for impeachment on the grounds of obstruction of justice and contempt of court. Now, impeachment requires the House to vote to impeach and the Senate to vote to convict. And we know that Republicans currently control both chambers. So the odds of Trump actually being removed from office are probably low unless the political situation changes dramatically. But here's the thing. An impeachment proceeding, even if it doesn't result in removal, is a massive political disaster. It consumes all the oxygen in Washington. It dominates the news cycle. It forces every single member of Congress to go on the record about whether they think the president should be held accountable for defying the Supreme Court. And it feeds into a narrative of chaos and lawlessness that's going to hurt Republicans in the midterms and damage Trump's legacy. And if Trump is defying the Supreme Court, you're also going to see a constitutional crisis where the executive branch is openly at war with the judicial branch. And that's the kind of thing that makes allies nervous, that makes investors nervous, that makes voters nervous. And that could spiral into something much bigger if it's not resolved quickly. Fifth, there's the international dimension. And this is something that's not getting enough attention, but it's absolutely critical. When Trump's financial records come out, we're potentially going to see exactly what his financial relationships with foreign governments and foreign entities look like. If it turns out that he owes significant amounts of money to Russian banks, that he's been receiving payments from Saudi state-owned companies, that he's got business deals in China that create leverage for Beijing, that fundamentally changes the context for every foreign policy decision he's made and every decision he's going to make going forward. Allies are going to start asking whether Trump's decisions on NATO funding, on support for Ukraine, on Middle East policy, on trade with China, are based on what's best for the United States or what's best for Trump's financial interests. Adversaries are going to use this to undermine American credibility and to argue that the U.S. is led by someone who's compromised and corrupt. And international institutions and markets are going to start pricing in the risk that American foreign policy is being driven by personal financial considerations rather than by national interests, which is going to make it harder for the U.S. to lead on the global stage and harder to convince allies to follow American leadership. Sixth, let's talk about the economic and market implications because they're real and they're already starting to play out. Markets hate uncertainty. And what we've got right now is massive uncertainty about whether the president is going to comply with a Supreme Court order, what's going to be in the financial records when they come out, and whether this is going to trigger a political crisis that consumes Washington for months. You're already seeing volatility in the markets. You're seeing investors starting to pull back from riskier assets. You're seeing questions about whether the administration is going to be able to focus on economic policy when it's dealing with legal battles and potential impeachment proceedings. If this drags on, if Trump defies the court and we end up in a prolonged constitutional crisis, you could see real economic consequences in terms of consumer confidence, business investment, and international capital flows. And if the financial records reveal something truly damaging, if they show clear evidence of financial crimes or of the president being compromised by foreign entities, you could see a serious crisis of confidence in American institutions that would have ripple effects through the entire global economy. Seventh, this is going to reshape the Republican Party in ways that are hard to predict but are definitely going to be significant. You've got a party that's increasingly defined by loyalty to Trump. But you've also got a growing number of Republicans who are exhausted by the constant chaos, who are worried about their own political futures, and who remember that they're supposed to be the party of law and order and respect for institutions. This Supreme Court decision is going to force those Republicans to make a choice. Are they going to stand with Trump even if it means standing against the Supreme Court and arguing that the president should be allowed to defy lawful court orders? Or are they going to break with Trump and say that the rule of law matters more than personal loyalty? Some of them are going to stick with Trump no matter what because that's where their base is and because they're afraid of being primaried. But some of them are going to start looking for an exit, are going to start distancing themselves, are going to start making the calculation that defending Trump on this is a losing proposition politically and that they need to be on the right side of history. And if enough Republicans start to break away, if the dam starts to crack, you could see a realignment within the party that changes the entire landscape of American politics going into 2026 and 2028. So here's the bottom line. The Supreme Court has just delivered a decision that could define Trump's presidency, that could reshape the balance of power between the branches of government. And that could determine whether the principle that no one is above the law still means anything in this country. Trump has 24 hours to comply with a lawful court order to turn over his financial records. And if he refuses, he's going to be facing contempt proceedings that could include escalating sanctions and potential impeachment. The political ramifications are enormous because this is going to dominate the news. It's going to force Republicans to choose between Trump and the rule of law, and it's going to give Democrats a massive issue to run on in the midterms. The institutional ramifications are just as big because this is the Supreme Court asserting that executive privilege has limits, that congressional oversight is real, and that the president cannot simply refuse to comply with court orders when it's inconvenient. The international ramifications are potentially devastating because allies are going to be questioning American leadership. Adversaries are going to be exploiting the chaos, and markets are going to be pricing in the risk of prolonged instability. And the substantive ramifications, once these financial records actually come out, could be absolutely explosive if they show what a lot of people suspect they're going to show, which is conflicts of interest, potential crimes, and financial ties to foreign entities that compromise the president's ability to put American interests first. This story is far from over. In fact, it's just getting started. Over the next 24 hours, we're going to see whether Trump complies or whether he decides to defy the Supreme Court and trigger a constitutional crisis. Over the next few weeks and months, we're going to see what's actually in those financial records and what they reveal about Trump's business dealings and potential conflicts of interest. And over the next year and a half leading into the 2026 midterms, we're going to see whether the American political system is capable of holding a president accountable or whether we've reached a point where the executive branch is effectively above the law. Keep your eyes on this because what happens next could define American democracy for a generation. This is the kind of moment that history books are written about, and we're living through it in real time.